Imagine this. You wake up one morning just like any other, you go about your day, and by evening you find yourself pulling into the driveway of what you believe is your home. It's the place you've parked 1,000 times, the one spot in the world where everything should feel familiar, warm, and safe. You step out of the car, you walk up the front steps, and the door swings open before you can even reach for the handle. And standing there, smiling at you like she's been waiting all day, is your wife. She leans in, she greets you with a kiss, her voice soft, her touch familiar, everything about her exactly as it has always been. But then, your stomach twists, your chest tightens because something is wrong. This isn't your house. The walls are painted differently, the pictures hanging in the hallway don't belong to you, the furniture doesn't match, and you realize that every single detail surrounding you is unfamiliar, except for her. She looks exactly the same, she acts exactly the same, but the world around you is not yours. And that's when you realize you're standing in the middle of someone else's home, being kissed by your wife like everything is normal. Now let me stop right here and ask you, what would you do in that moment? Would you pull away, confront her, demand to know what was happening? Or would you let her hold you close, pretending to play along until you could figure out what exactly went wrong in your reality? I want you to sit with that question because over the next few minutes as I take you through this story, you are going to feel what I felt in that exact moment. Confusion. Fear. A sense that something is deeply off but so subtle, so perfectly blended into normal life, that you can't even trust your own senses anymore. And I promise you this, by the end of this story you're going to get the answer you came here for. You'll understand why I stepped into that house, why my wife kissed me like nothing had changed, and why the truth I uncovered has haunted me every single day since. So don't click away, don't skip ahead because every single detail matters, and if you miss a piece, you might never be able to put the puzzle together. Here's the thing, when you hear stories like this online, when you see a title that says, "My wife greeted me with a kiss, but it wasn't my house," your first thought might be, okay, maybe it's just a prank, or maybe it's one of those dreamlike moments when you're too tired to tell reality apart from imagination. But I need you to know that what I'm about to share with you is not some wild exaggeration. It's not just a spooky tale meant to grab attention. This happened, and when it happened, I wasn't just fighting confusion, I was fighting for my sense of self, my marriage, and my sanity. Because if the one person you trust more than anyone else in the world, the person who's supposed to be your safe place, suddenly doesn't fit into the world the way you remember it, then what else can you rely on? What else in your life can you be sure of? Let me paint this picture for you more clearly. I had just finished work, a long exhausting day where all I wanted was to come home, eat dinner, and relax with my wife. Everything felt routine. The drive, the turn onto my street, even the way I slowed down in front of my house. But as soon as I stepped onto the porch, something inside me hesitated. It was small at first, the kind of thing you ignore, like when you notice your neighbors trimmed their hedges or painted their mailbox. But then the details started piling up. The light above the door wasn't the same one I had screwed in last summer. The welcome mat wasn't the faded one we'd had for years, it was newer, cleaner, like it had been bought recently. And then the door creaked open and there she was. My wife. Smiling. Radiant. Like nothing was wrong. And here's the part that really messes with your head. When someone you love greets you like that, all your instincts tell you not to question it. She leaned in, kissed me like she had every day for the last decade, and for a second I almost forgot what I was seeing around me. Her perfume, her warmth, the way her hair brushed my face, it all screamed this is real, this is home. But then, over her shoulder, I saw the hallway. The photos hanging on the wall were not ours. The family smiling back in those frames was not us. It was someone else. Strangers. Smiling in a home that felt like it should be mine. And that's when my heart dropped into my stomach. Now, I know you're thinking, could it have been a simple mistake? Maybe I walked into the wrong house, maybe I was just tired and distracted. But no. That excuse falls apart the second you realize she was already there, waiting for me as if she knew I'd arrive at that exact moment. She wasn't surprised, she wasn't confused, she didn't say, "Oh my God, what are you doing here?" Instead, she kissed me, called me by name, and acted like nothing was out of place. Which begs the question, was it really the wrong house? Or was it my house that had changed, without me ever noticing? This is where you and I need to get real for a second. Because I want you to feel how personal this is. This isn't just a mystery, it's about trust, about identity, about whether or not the life you've built can vanish in an instant. And I know some of you watching have had moments where reality didn't quite add up. Maybe you walked into a room and swore you left something in a spot, but it wasn't there anymore. Maybe you've had déjà vu so strong it left you shaken. Or maybe someone close to you has said or done something so out of character, so foreign, that you couldn't shake the feeling that you didn't really know them at all. That's the kind of fear I was living in the second I stepped into that house. So here I was, standing in the doorway of a place I didn't recognize, kissed by the woman I married, while strangers' faces stared at me from picture frames. My brain scrambled to make sense of it, searching for an explanation. Had we moved? Did I forget something? Was this some elaborate surprise? But deep down I knew none of those answers fit. And when I finally found the courage to speak, to ask her the one question burning in my chest, her response didn't bring clarity. It made everything worse. She looked at me, her smile fading ever so slightly, and she whispered something that made the room tilt under my feet. Something I can still hear in my head even now. And that's where I need to stop for now, because what she said is the key to everything that followed: the unraveling of my reality, the danger that crept into my life, and the truth that I never expected to uncover. If you want to understand how it all unfolded, you need to stay with me, because every twist in this story will challenge the way you see your own world. When she whispered those words, it was like my whole body froze. My wife's voice, usually steady and familiar, carried something that didn't match the person I thought I knew. It wasn't just what she said, it was how she said it. There was a softness in her tone, almost rehearsed, like she had been waiting to say it at just the right moment. My heart pounded so hard that I could hear it in my ears, and for a split second I wondered if this was all in my head. Maybe I was exhausted from work, maybe stress was finally catching up to me, or maybe my mind was playing cruel tricks. But the problem was, everything felt too real to dismiss. The way the hardwood floor creaked under my shoes, the cool draft drifting through the hallway, even the faint smell of something cooking in the kitchen, all of it screamed reality. And if this was real, then I needed answers. I should probably step back here and give you some context, because this didn't come out of nowhere. The last few weeks of my life had been heavy, filled with the kind of stress that wears you down so slowly you don't even notice how different you've become until you catch yourself in the mirror and barely recognize the person staring back. Work had been brutal. I'm talking late nights, phone calls that didn't stop, pressure from every angle. And through all of that, my wife had been my anchor. Or at least that's what I thought. She had been patient, understanding, even encouraging me to take care of myself when I felt like I couldn't stop moving. But now, standing in a house that wasn't mine, greeted by her as if it was, I couldn't help but replay everything in my head, searching for moments I had missed, signs that something wasn't right. There were small things now that I think back. Little gaps in conversation where she seemed distracted, like her mind was somewhere else. Nights when she'd stay up later than usual, saying she couldn't sleep, pacing quietly through the house. And then there were the phone calls she didn't want me to hear. She'd step out onto the porch or into another room, lowering her voice just enough that I couldn't make out the words. I brushed it off at the time. Everybody has private conversations, right? But standing there, in that unfamiliar hallway, I realized maybe those moments weren't so innocent. Maybe they were pieces of a puzzle I hadn't even realized I was solving. As I tried to steady myself, she slipped her hand into mine, guiding me further inside like nothing was out of place. The strangest part was how natural it all felt to her, like she belonged here, like we both belonged here. She asked me about my day, smiled when I told her it had been long, and leaned her head against my shoulder as if this was a nightly routine. The problem was, I couldn't stop staring at the walls, the furniture, the pictures of strangers smiling back at me. I didn't recognize a single thing, but she acted like I should. And that's when paranoia began to creep in. Was this some elaborate joke? Did someone set me up? Or was I losing my grip on reality altogether? I need you to understand something here, because this is the part of the story where you start asking yourself what you would do in my shoes. Would you confront her right then and there? Would you shout, demand answers, point at the photos on the wall and accuse her of lying? Or would you play along, pretending not to notice, giving yourself time to figure out the truth without tipping her off? That's the exact choice I was facing, and I knew whichever path I took could change everything. But before I could even make that decision, I started noticing details that threw me off even more. On the coffee table in the living room sat a set of keys I didn't recognize. A man's watch lay neatly beside them, but it wasn't mine. I felt the air catch in my throat as I stared at it, because it meant someone else lived here, or at least spent enough time here to leave personal things behind. My wife didn't flinch. She didn't rush to hide them or offer an explanation. Instead, she moved gracefully through the room, humming softly, as if this was the most normal evening in the world. And that's where the red flags began to multiply. My mind started racing with possibilities, each one darker than the last. Could she be hiding another relationship? Was I walking straight into someone else's life without realizing it? Or worse, was she part of something bigger, something I couldn't even begin to understand yet? Every detail I noticed seemed designed to confuse me further, like layers of a story that wouldn't quite add up no matter how hard I tried. You see, this is what makes situations like this so terrifying. It's not the obvious threats that scare you, it's the uncertainty. It's the way reality bends just enough to make you doubt your memory, your instincts, your trust in the people closest to you. And as I stood there, pretending to settle into this strange version of my home, I realized that my wife might not be the only piece of this puzzle. There could be others, neighbors, coworkers, even friends, who knew more than they were letting on. People who might smile at me in the daylight while hiding secrets I wasn't supposed to uncover. Looking back now, I can see how the stage was being set, how every little inconsistency was like a breadcrumb leading me deeper into the woods. The late-night phone calls, the unexplained absences, even the way she'd sometimes look at me like she was measuring me, like she was asking herself if I was really the man she remembered. At the time, I didn't connect the dots. But in that house, surrounded by things that weren't mine, kissed by the woman I loved, I knew I had stumbled into something much bigger than myself. And just when I thought I couldn't take the silence anymore, just when I opened my mouth to demand answers, there was a sound from down the hall. A door creaked. Footsteps echoed slowly toward us. My wife didn't even turn to look. She kept smiling at me as if she already knew who it was. My pulse spiked, my palms went cold, and I braced myself for whatever or whoever was about to walk into that room. The footsteps grew louder, slow and deliberate, and each second that passed felt like an eternity. My wife didn't move. She didn't even glance toward the sound. Instead, she kept her eyes locked on mine, a small, almost reassuring smile fixed on her face, as if she had been expecting this moment. And then, just before the figure appeared, she tightened her grip on my hand in a way that sent a chill through me. It wasn't affectionate, it was firm, almost controlling, like she didn't want me to react. When the figure finally stepped into the room, it wasn't what I expected. It was a little girl. No older than 7, maybe 8. Her hair was neatly braided, her dress clean and pressed, and she carried herself with the kind of calm you don't usually see in children. But here's the part that stopped me cold. She looked directly at me and said, "Daddy, you're home late again." I don't have kids. My wife and I had talked about starting a family, but we hadn't taken that step. And yet, this little girl spoke to me like she had known me her whole life. She smiled, her eyes bright with recognition, as if my arrival was the highlight of her day. My wife didn't flinch. She didn't try to explain, didn't laugh it off, didn't act surprised. She just nodded gently toward the girl and said, "Go wash up for dinner." The child obeyed without hesitation, disappearing back down the hallway. And just like that, the room fell into silence again, leaving me frozen, my mind unraveling. I wanted to demand answers right then, but something about the way my wife looked at me held me back. It was almost like she was daring me to speak, like she knew the questions burning in my head but was waiting for me to cross some invisible line. And that's when I realized I couldn't push too hard, not yet. If this was some elaborate deception, if there were others involved, then showing my hand too early could make everything worse. I decided to play along, at least until I could figure out what was really happening. But inside, my thoughts were spiraling. Who was that little girl? Why did she call me Dad? And why did my wife act like nothing about this was strange? Over the next few days, I started digging quietly, trying to piece together what had happened. I retraced my steps, checked my phone, even drove past the places I thought of as home just to reassure myself I wasn't losing my mind. But here's where things got complicated. Every time I thought I found a thread to pull, it disappeared. The photos on the walls, when I tried to look at them more closely, they were gone the next day, replaced with different images that didn't match my memory. The watch and keys I saw on the coffee table vanished as if they had never been there. Even the little girl, who had looked at me with such certainty, started avoiding me. She would slip into rooms just before I entered, closing the door behind her, leaving me with nothing but silence. That's when I realized someone was deliberately covering their tracks, making it harder for me to confirm what I'd seen. Every time I tried to hold on to proof, it vanished. And the more I searched, the more I felt like I was being watched. My phone would glitch when I tried to take photos, conversations I swore I had with my wife would be brushed off like I was misremembering, and small items of mine would go missing, only to reappear in odd places days later. It wasn't just confusion anymore, it was control. Someone wanted me to question myself so much that I'd eventually stop asking questions. Then came the warning. It didn't come from my wife. It came from someone I never expected. A coworker, someone I barely spoke to outside of the office, pulled me aside one afternoon. He leaned in close, his voice low enough that no one else could hear, and said, "Stop looking. You don't want to know what she's hiding." I froze, my blood running cold because I hadn't told anyone what was happening. Not a single word. And yet, here he was, speaking like he knew everything. Before I could press him for answers, he walked away, blending back into the crowd, leaving me with more questions than I could handle. That night, I confronted my wife, not directly but carefully. I asked her about old memories, things only we should know. Vacations, family gatherings, even the night we first met. At first, she answered perfectly, smiling as she recalled details that lined up with mine. But then, as I pushed further, tiny cracks began to appear. She remembered things differently, sometimes in ways that didn't make sense. She would laugh it off, say I must be tired or that my memory was fuzzy. But the more she did that, the more I knew something wasn't right. It wasn't just about a house or a child, it was about our entire history. And then, buried in the back of my mind, a memory surfaced. Something I hadn't thought about in years. There had been a night, early in our marriage, when she had left suddenly. She said her mother was sick, that she needed to be away for a few days. When she returned, she never talked about it again, and I didn't push her. But now, standing in this fractured version of my life, I couldn't help but wonder if that was when it all started. If there had been something about her past, some secret I had overlooked, that was now bleeding into our present. The tension kept building, like a weight pressing down on me from every direction. I didn't know who to trust, and I wasn't even sure I could trust myself anymore. And just when I thought I had finally found a clue I could hold on to, something happened that shook me even more. Late one night, when I was sure my wife was asleep, I crept into the living room to search. I looked under cushions, inside drawers, anywhere I thought I might find something, anything, that could prove I wasn't losing my mind. And that's when I found it. A small envelope tucked beneath the couch cushions, sealed but unmarked. My hands trembled as I opened it, my pulse racing with anticipation. Inside was a photograph. Faded, old, but clear enough to make out. It was of me. Younger, maybe in my early 20s, standing beside a woman who looked almost identical to my wife, but not quite. Her features were sharper, her smile slightly different, her eyes carrying a weight that sent a chill through me. Scrawled on the back of the photo were 5 words that made my stomach drop. You were never meant to stay. And just as the words sank in, I heard the floorboards creak behind me. I froze with the photograph in my hands, the words on the back burning into me like a brand. You were never meant to stay. The moment was so charged that I barely registered the creak of the floorboards behind me until it was too late. I spun around, clutching the photo, expecting to see my wife standing there in the shadows. But it wasn't her. It was the little girl. She stood halfway down the hallway, her face half hidden in the dark, watching me with an expression that was far too knowing for a child her age. For a second, neither of us moved, the silence so heavy it almost felt alive. Then, in the faintest whisper, she said, "You weren't supposed to find that." And before I could say a word, she turned and slipped away, the sound of her footsteps vanishing as quickly as they came. I should have chased her. I should have pressed her for answers, demanded to know what she meant. But the truth is, I was paralyzed, caught between fear and disbelief. How could this child, who I wasn't even supposed to have, know about the photograph, about the message that was clearly meant for me? Questions spun so fast in my mind I could barely keep up, and yet, even as I stood there shaking, I realized I wasn't the only one being pulled into whatever this was. Because the very next day I got a call from my sister. She doesn't call me often, not unless it's important, so when her name lit up my phone, I answered immediately. Her voice was shaky, and before I could even ask what was wrong, she blurted out, "Did you send me this?" I asked what she was talking about, and she told me she had found an envelope slipped under her front door that morning. Inside was a photograph of her, younger, maybe in high school, standing with a man neither of us recognized. On the back of her photo were the exact same words written in the same jagged handwriting, "You were never meant to stay." I nearly dropped the phone. The odds of us both receiving something like that couldn't be brushed off as coincidence, and the fact that it came so close on the heels of my discovery told me someone was watching not just me, but the people I cared about. I wanted to tell her everything, about the strange house, about the little girl, about the photograph I had found, but something stopped me. A voice in the back of my head warned me not to share too much, not yet. If I dragged her into this any deeper, I might be putting her in danger too. So instead, I asked her to keep the photo safe and promised I would come by soon to talk it through. She agreed, but I could hear the fear in her voice, the same kind of fear I had been living with since stepping into that house. As if that wasn't enough to unravel me, another detail cropped up that same week that threw everything I thought I knew into question. I had been obsessively checking the photo I found, holding it under different lights, running my fingers over the back like I could somehow rub the truth out of the ink. And then one evening, I noticed something I hadn't before. There was a faint smudge in the corner, like part of another message had been erased. Underneath, barely visible, were 3 letters, DT. At first it didn't mean anything. But later that night when I was scrolling through old emails, one word jumped out at me. It was an old project from work I had been assigned years ago, something classified, something I had been told to forget once it was over. Its code name? Datum. The more I thought about it, the more the connections gnawed at me. Could this have anything to do with my job? Was this bigger than just my wife, bigger than just my family? Or was it some cruel trick, someone twisting fragments of my past into a narrative designed to drive me mad? I couldn't tell. What I did know was that someone out there had gone to incredible lengths to make sure I was left questioning everything and everyone. And that's when paranoia began to seep into every part of my life. Friends I'd known for years suddenly felt like strangers. The coworker who had warned me to stop digging, I started to wonder if he was part of it, if his warning wasn't meant to protect me but to steer me away from uncovering something I was getting too close to. Even my sister, the one person I thought I could trust without question, now seemed like she might know more than she was saying. What if the photo she received wasn't meant to scare her at all, but to lure me in deeper, to make me reveal what I had found? The more I tried to make sense of it, the more tangled everything became. And then, just as I thought I couldn't take another layer of uncertainty, the little girl reappeared. I found her sitting at the kitchen table one morning, quietly drawing with crayons. At first it seemed innocent enough, but when I leaned closer to see what she was working on, my stomach dropped. It wasn't a picture of a house or a family or anything a child might normally draw. It was a map. Crude, with jagged lines and smudges, but unmistakably a map. And at the very center of it, circled over and over again in red crayon, was a single word written in shaky block letters: leave. I wanted to ask her what it meant, where she had seen it, why she was drawing it at all. But before I could, she slid the paper toward me, her eyes wide and serious, and whispered, "They're not going to let you." The words sent a chill racing through me, colder than anything I had felt before, because they weren't just the words of a frightened child. They sounded like a warning, rehearsed, like she had been told to deliver it. And just as I opened my mouth to press her further, the front door opened and my wife stepped inside, carrying groceries as if nothing in the world was wrong. The little girl immediately crumpled the drawing in her small fists, hiding it beneath the table, her lips pressed tightly together as if she had said too much already. In that moment, everything inside me screamed that I was close to something, that the answers were right there, hidden in plain sight. But at the same time, I realized I wasn't just chasing the truth anymore, I was being chased by it. And every clue I found, every piece of evidence I uncovered, seemed to vanish or twist into something else before I could make sense of it. And then, just when I thought I couldn't be pulled any deeper, another envelope appeared. This time it wasn't left for me. It wasn't left for my sister. It was slipped under my neighbor's door. A man I barely knew who had no connection to me or my wife, or so I thought. He showed up at my doorstep the next day, pale and shaking, holding the envelope out to me with trembling hands. Inside was another photograph. This time it was of all three of us, me, my wife, and him, standing together in a place I had never been, smiling like lifelong friends. And scrawled on the back was a single sentence that made my blood run cold. She already chose one of us. When I saw that photograph the neighbor brought me, something inside me cracked in a way that I couldn't hide anymore. Up until then, I had been juggling confusion, paranoia, and denial, trying to convince myself that there might still be some rational explanation, some thread of reality I could hold on to. But staring at that image, me, my wife, and my neighbor, smiling like a trio of lifelong friends in a place I knew I had never stood, made it clear that whatever this was, it had spread far beyond the walls of that house. It wasn't just me losing grip on memory, it wasn't just a trick of perception. Someone or something was deliberately rewriting the story of my life, and I couldn't tell where the lies ended and the truth began. My neighbor's face was pale as he shoved the envelope into my hands, his eyes darting toward the street like he was terrified of being seen. "I don't know what this is, but I don't want any part of it," he muttered before hurrying away, leaving me standing there on the porch with the weight of that photograph pulling me deeper into the pit I'd been circling since the day I walked into that house. That night I couldn't sleep. Every creak of the floorboards, every faint gust of wind outside felt like a warning, like something was moving in the shadows just out of sight. I lay there next to my wife, who slept peacefully, her breathing slow and steady, and I couldn't stop staring at her. Was she part of this? Was she leading me into a trap, or was she a pawn just like me? The questions gnawed at me until I finally slipped out of bed and paced through the house. That's when I noticed it, the faint glow of headlights parked across the street. At first I thought it was a car pulling over, maybe someone on their phone, but when I peeked through the blinds an hour later, the car was still there. No movement, no engine running, just the eerie outline of someone sitting in the driver's seat, watching. My skin crawled as I realized they weren't even trying to hide. Whoever it was, they wanted me to know I was being watched. I tried to shake it off, to tell myself it could be coincidence, but deep down I knew better. And when I finally worked up the nerve to step outside, to confront whoever was sitting there, the car pulled away slowly, like they had gotten what they came for. I stood in the middle of the driveway, my heart pounding, the cold night air biting at my skin, and I felt something I hadn't felt before, not just confusion or fear, but the heavy certainty that I was in danger. Not in some vague, unsettling way, but real physical danger. The next morning confirmed it. My sister, the one who had received the photograph just days earlier, stopped answering her phone. At first I thought maybe she was busy or avoiding me, but by evening I knew something was wrong. Her car was still in her driveway, the lights in her house off, but her phone went straight to voicemail every time I called. I drove over, knocked on her door until my knuckles ached, but no one answered. When I circled to the back of the house, I noticed her back door was slightly ajar, the lock splintered like it had been forced open. Inside the house was eerily still. Nothing looked out of place, no broken furniture, no signs of struggle, but the silence was suffocating. It was the kind of silence that tells you someone left quickly or was made to leave. On the kitchen table sat her phone, face down, the screen cracked like it had been dropped. And next to it, folded neatly as if someone had placed it there on purpose, was another envelope. I didn't want to open it, not there, not in that heavy silence, but I knew I had no choice. My hands trembled as I slid the paper out. It wasn't a photograph this time. It was a handwritten note, the words jagged and rushed like they had been scrawled in a hurry. "You're asking the wrong questions. Stop before you lose her too." My chest tightened as I read it over and over, the meaning clear enough. My sister was gone, and if I kept digging, my wife would be next. For a moment I couldn't breathe. It felt like the walls were closing in, like the entire house was leaning toward me, pressing me down with the weight of that threat. Driving home that night, every pair of headlights in my rearview mirror felt like a predator's eyes. Every shadow stretching across the road made me clench the wheel tighter. The paranoia was no longer subtle, it was overwhelming, the kind that makes your heart race until you can't tell the difference between instinct and imagination. I kept replaying everything in my head, every warning, every envelope, every whispered phrase that had been dropped like breadcrumbs in front of me. My wife's strange absences, the little girl's chilling map, the coworker who told me to stop digging, it was all connected, I just couldn't see how. But the part that haunted me most wasn't the threats or the watching car or even my sister's disappearance. It was the realization that I couldn't trust anyone, not even the woman lying beside me every night. Because when I finally walked through the front door that evening, shaken and pale, my wife looked up at me with those soft, steady eyes and asked, "Were you followed?" She said it so casually, so smoothly, as if it was a perfectly normal question. And in that moment, I couldn't tell if she was trying to protect me, or if she already knew exactly what was happening, because she was part of it all along. I wanted to scream at her, demand to know how she could possibly ask that, but I bit my tongue. Because if she was involved, showing my fear would only give her more control. And if she wasn't, if she was trapped in this nightmare with me, then pushing too hard might drive her away. So I nodded, forcing a smile, pretending everything was fine. But inside I felt the ground slipping out from under me. I realized that whatever game I had stumbled into, I was running out of time. And worse, I wasn't sure if I was even supposed to make it out. And just when I thought the night couldn't get darker, I noticed something that nearly broke me. On our refrigerator, pinned beneath a magnet shaped like a smiling sun, was a drawing. Childlike, scribbled in crayon just like the one the little girl had shown me before. Only this time, the word circled in red wasn't leave. It was my name. The twist came the way most devastating truths arrive. Quietly, like a whisper in the dark that changes everything once you finally lean close enough to hear it. After days of pacing my mind raw, retracing each strange detail, each warning, each disappearance that seemed designed to rattle me more than inform me, I thought I had started piecing things together. But then she told me, my wife, the woman whose kiss first pulled me into this nightmare, that she wasn't the one who had kissed me that night. She said it in a flat, unflinching voice, as if she'd been waiting for the right moment to unload the weight that had been burning her up from the inside. For a second, I didn't even process it, because how do you make sense of a confession like that? The lips, the voice, the gentle touch of a hand that I'd known better than my own, it had felt real, so real, and yet she looked at me with eyes stripped of warmth and swore she hadn't been there. She hadn't stepped into that house. She hadn't greeted me. She hadn't kissed me. And if she hadn't, then someone had, someone who could slip inside my life so easily I didn't notice the difference until it was already too late. The room went cold as my stomach twisted into a knot, because the revelation wasn't just strange, it was terrifying. If she hadn't been the one who stood in that unfamiliar house, who smiled like her, who moved like her, then what did that mean for me? Had I been tricked? Lured? Set up by someone who knew every single intimate detail of my marriage? My first instinct was denial, to shake my head, to tell her she must be lying, but the way she watched me, her hands trembling in her lap, made me realize this wasn't a game. She wasn't trying to confuse me, she was warning me. And as she spoke, I began to understand why. She told me that before we met, before we built this life together, there had been someone else. Someone who had wanted her, needed her, and refused to let go even after she chose to move on. She never mentioned him because she thought the past was buried, that time had dissolved his obsession, but she had seen him again recently. At first, she thought it was just her imagination, a shadow in a store window, a face across a crowded street. But then the letters started arriving. Handwritten notes with no return address, each one filled with words that echoed things she had only ever whispered to me in the dark. Promises of eternal devotion. Threats that if she didn't come back, he'd make sure she paid. Suddenly everything shifted. The house, the kiss, the eerie way the world had bent that night, it all fit into a puzzle I didn't know I was solving. What if that night wasn't a coincidence? What if I had been led there by design into a life-size trap? Someone out there was skilled enough to mimic her presence, bold enough to slip into the cracks of our marriage, and patient enough to watch us until the moment was perfect. My wife's confession wasn't just about fear, it was a plea for me to understand that we were dealing with something much bigger than marital confusion. We were dealing with a ghost from her past that had learned how to walk in the present. But then she said something that gutted me. This wasn't the first time it had happened. She admitted that years ago, back when she was still trying to sever ties with this man, she had come home one night and found her own belongings rearranged, her perfume sprayed on her pillow, her voice on a cassette tape playing in her apartment even though she hadn't recorded it. It was as if he could rewrite reality, replace her presence with his version of it, making her doubt herself until she nearly lost her mind. She left town soon after and thought she'd escaped him, but looking into her eyes now, I realized she knew what I was just beginning to accept. He was back, and this time he wasn't playing in shadows. He was stepping into my life, into my marriage, and using the one thing I loved most in the world as his disguise. I wanted to scream, to tear the walls down until I found some hidden passage that explained how someone could manipulate us like this, but instead I just sat there, numb, while she whispered the part that made my blood run cold. The night I walked into that unfamiliar house and thought it was ours, the man from her past had called her phone. She didn't answer, but the voicemail he left was short and clear. "You'll see me soon," through his eyes. And that's when it hit me, the possibility I had been too afraid to name before. This wasn't just about someone copying her. It wasn't just about obsession. Somehow, he was weaving himself into me, into my perspective, making me doubt my own senses. The house, the kiss, the familiarity of something so wrong, it wasn't just happening around me. It was happening to me. Which meant I wasn't just in danger of losing her. I was in danger of losing myself. The weight of it all pressed against me like a suffocating fog, and for the first time since this entire nightmare began, I realized I couldn't just sit back and hope things sorted themselves out. Every step forward only tangled me deeper into a web I didn't even know existed, and yet the thought of turning back felt impossible. That was when the impossible choice landed in my lap, not in the form of some dramatic showdown, but in a whisper that came when I least expected it. A neighbor, someone I had casually waved to on morning jogs and never thought twice about, pulled me aside and said something that rattled me to the core. "She's not who you think she is, and if you want to make it out alive, you need to stop asking questions." I could see the terror in his eyes, the kind that doesn't come from gossip or curiosity but from lived experience. He slipped me a folded piece of paper so fast I almost didn't catch it and walked away without looking back. When I opened it, all it said was, "Pick truth or safety, you can't have both." That moment gutted me because it made everything brutally real. Up until then, I'd been convincing myself that maybe this was just a misunderstanding, some kind of twisted setup that I could logically unravel if I paid close enough attention. But staring at those words, I knew I was in the kind of game where choices came with irreversible consequences. Do I keep digging even if it meant losing everything I loved, including my wife, the woman who kissed me inside a house that wasn't mine? Or do I protect myself, close my eyes, and live with the gnawing, endless suspicion that would eat me alive until my final breath? Either way, the price was heavy, and I knew deep down that there was no middle ground. The cruel part was that I wasn't the only one entangled anymore. My wife had started acting more erratic, more secretive, like she knew the walls were closing in. Sometimes she'd stare at me like she was trying to decide whether to confide in me or cut me out completely, and other times she'd vanish without explanation, reappearing with a flimsy excuse that made less sense the more I replayed it. And then there was the eerie silence from my closest friend, the one person I thought I could lean on. He stopped answering my calls, stopped responding to messages, and it wasn't until days later that I found out he had suddenly left town, no goodbye, no explanation. It was like people around me were disappearing or pulling away just as the pressure mounted, leaving me isolated with nothing but impossible decisions and unanswered questions. And then came the ultimatum, as if the universe had decided to test just how much I could endure before breaking. An anonymous message arrived on my phone, the kind that made the blood drain from your face the moment you read it. It wasn't long, wasn't poetic, but it cut straight to the bone. Tell her what you know or lose her forever. There was no number attached, no way to trace it, but I could feel the malice behind it, like someone had been watching me, waiting for the exact moment when I was at my weakest. The choice it presented was cruel beyond words. If I confronted her, I risked exposing myself and possibly destroying whatever fragile reality we still had left. But if I stayed silent, I might never see her again. Not as the woman I loved, not as the person I built a life with. The sheer brutality of it was that I didn't even know what truth they wanted me to tell. What did they think I knew? What secret was I supposed to hold in my hands? This was no longer just about uncovering answers. It was about survival, about navigating a maze where every corner could either lead to clarity or my undoing. And the more I weighed my options, the clearer it became that there was no safe move, no easy path forward. The people closest to me had become suspects in their own right. My wife, my friends, even the neighbors I once trusted without question. The paranoia wasn't just in my head anymore, it was in every interaction, every glance, every silence that stretched a second too long. And as much as I wanted to cling to the hope that I could find the truth without losing everything, the shadows around me seemed to whisper the same warning over and over. You can't save both yourself and the people you love. What I didn't realize then was that the next choice I made would set the entire course of this nightmare into motion, locking me into a path I couldn't reverse. The ultimatum was no longer a distant threat. It was real, immediate, and unavoidable. And as I prepared myself to decide, a knock at the door shattered the fragile stillness of the room, and my blood turned to ice when I realized who was standing on the other side. The knock on the door was sharp, deliberate, the kind of sound that wasn't just a neighbor dropping by or a delivery at the wrong house. It was the kind of knock that made your gut tighten before you even moved, because some part of you already knew that nothing good was waiting on the other side. When I finally pulled the door open, my stomach dropped. The person standing there wasn't a stranger, wasn't an anonymous shadow I could dismiss as paranoia. It was someone I knew, someone I had trusted without question, someone I had leaned on through other storms in my life. It was my brother. And the moment I saw his face, pale and cold with a guilt he couldn't hide, I knew that the conspiracy I had been clawing my way through wasn't just circling me, it was rooted in my own blood. He didn't speak at first, just pushed his way inside like he owned the space, shutting the door firmly behind him. The silence between us was suffocating, heavy enough to make my ears ring, until finally he said, "You should have stopped asking questions." That was when it hit me. He wasn't here to help, he wasn't here to protect me, he was here because he had been part of this all along. My mind reeled, trying to stitch together all the moments that suddenly felt like red flags I had ignored. The times he had brushed off my suspicions, the way he always seemed to know too much about my wife's whereabouts, the subtle pressure to let it go whenever I got close to uncovering something real. And in that moment, the betrayal cut deeper than any threat from a stranger could have, because if I couldn't trust him, then who did I have left? The urgency of the situation crashed over me like a tidal wave. He wasn't alone in this, that much was obvious. His body language, the way his eyes darted toward the window as though someone outside was waiting for his signal, it all told me that the net had already closed in, that I was standing at the center of a conspiracy far bigger than anything I had dared to imagine. This wasn't about one secret, one lie, or one stolen kiss in a house that didn't belong to me. This was an orchestrated operation, something layered and sprawling, with more hands pulling the strings than I could count. And worst of all, I realized that my wife wasn't just a victim or a player on the sidelines. She was part of it too, though whether by choice or by force I couldn't yet tell. My brother leaned closer, his voice low and deliberate, the kind of tone that stripped away any illusion of family loyalty. You think you stumbled onto this by accident? You think any of this happened by chance? Every step you've taken, every discovery you thought was yours, it was placed in front of you. We needed to see how far you'd go, what kind of man you'd be when the truth brushed against you. And now you've gone too far. The words landed like knives, slicing through any last shred of safety I thought I had left. The conspiracy wasn't just around me, it had been studying me, manipulating me, using me as a pawn in a game I never agreed to play. That was when the full scale of it came crashing down. This wasn't about my marriage alone. This wasn't even just about my family. There were others, neighbors, coworkers, people I passed in the grocery store, faces that suddenly felt like masks hiding something much darker. It was a network, a web that stretched wider than I could comprehend, and I was standing in the center because I had refused to look away. My brother's betrayal wasn't just personal, it was proof that no one was off limits, that the lines between ally and enemy had been blurred beyond recognition. The room felt smaller by the second, the air heavier, as though the walls themselves were closing in on me. I knew that whatever choice I made in the next moments would define everything. Whether I lived, whether I ever saw my wife again, whether I had any chance of escaping the grip of whatever machine had been pulling us all like puppets. My chest pounded with the pressure of it, the raw fear mingling with fury as I realized that for the first time in my life, I was entirely alone. The people I loved had betrayed me, the people I trusted had lied to me, and the truth that I had been chasing had turned into a weapon aimed squarely at my heart. And then my brother said the one thing that shattered me completely: "She knows you're about to choose. And whichever way you go, you'll lose her." The words hung between us, poisonous and final, and I felt the ground shift beneath me. Because if what he said was true, then there was no escape, no version of this story where I could walk away with everything intact. The conspiracy wasn't just bigger than me, it had already decided my fate. The night of the climax didn't arrive with warning sirens or flashing lights. It came quietly, creeping into the edges of my life until I realized that the storm I had been trying to outrun was waiting for me in my own house. My brother's betrayal had ripped away the last illusion of safety, and now every breath I took felt borrowed. The truth was a weight pressing against my chest, threatening to crush me before I could even use it. But there was no turning back, too much had been uncovered, too much blood and trust had already been spilled. I had only one choice left: confront them all once and for all, and demand the answers that had been kept from me since this nightmare began. It happened in the basement, the one place in the house I had avoided since finding that mirror in the attic weeks before. My brother led me down the stairs like a prisoner, his silence more suffocating than threats could ever be. The moment we reached the bottom, I realized why. The basement wasn't just storage, it was a stage. And waiting for me under the harsh, buzzing light bulb was my wife. Her face was pale, her eyes rimmed with shadows, but there was no fear in them. There was only resignation, like she had known this moment was coming all along. And beside her, standing as though he had always belonged there, was a man I recognized from fragments of photographs and whispered warnings. He was the shadow I had been chasing, the name I had overheard her whisper in her sleep, the one she had been keeping the lights on for. The air in the basement was electric, heavy with the collision of truths that had been circling me for weeks. My wife didn't look away, didn't flinch, didn't even try to explain. Instead, it was the man who spoke, his voice steady, deliberate, and dripping with authority. "You were never supposed to know. She tried to protect you, but you're too much like her. You dig. You push. You don't stop when you should." His words felt like a verdict, each syllable confirming what I had feared. This wasn't random, wasn't accidental. My life had been orchestrated, controlled, manipulated into a narrative I never signed up for. My brother shifted beside me, tense but silent, his role clear now. He was never family in this story, he was a handler, a watchdog, a gatekeeper making sure I stayed within the invisible lines they had drawn. My wife's silence cut deeper than his betrayal, though. She didn't deny it. She didn't tell me he was lying. Instead, she stepped closer to the man and stood beside him. That one movement shattered me more than any confession could have, because it told me everything I needed to know. She had chosen her side long before this night. But then came the twist I didn't see coming, the moment that turned the confrontation into chaos. She looked at me, not at them, not at the floor, but directly at me, with a kind of desperation I had never seen in her before. And she whispered, barely audible over the hum of the bulb, "Run. Before they make you one of us." The words knocked the air out of my lungs. For a second I thought it was a trick, another layer of the manipulation meant to tear me apart. But then I saw it, the glimmer of tears she had been holding back, the trembling of her hands even as she stood beside the man she was supposed to serve. The room exploded after that. My brother lunged for me, but rage and adrenaline had finally burned away my hesitation. We crashed into the concrete floor, the fight brutal, animalistic, nothing like the staged battles you see in movies. Every punch was fueled by betrayal, every gasp by the knowledge that only one of us would walk out alive. The man shouted commands I couldn't process, My wife screamed for us to stop, but the basement became nothing but fists, blood, and the echo of bones striking against stone. And then in the chaos she made her move. My wife grabbed something from the workbench, a folder thick and heavy with documents, and hurled it toward me. "The truth is in there," she cried, her voice breaking, and for the first time I knew she wasn't lying. My brother's grip tightened around my throat, but I swung wildly, desperate enough to break free for a single moment, long enough to grab the folder and shove it under my arm like it was the only thing tethering me to reality. The final seconds blurred together. My brother's body hit the ground with a sickening thud after I smashed his head against the wall. The man stepped forward, his fury radiating like fire, but before he could strike, my wife stood between us. "If he goes down, I go with him," she said, her voice shaking but resolute. For the first time I saw fear in his eyes, not of me but of her. And in that hesitation I ran. I tore up the stairs, the folder clutched against my chest, my wife's voice echoing after me, part warning, part goodbye. I didn't stop until the cold night air hit my face, until the house was nothing but a silhouette behind me. My hands shook as I opened the folder, flipping through page after page of evidence. Photographs, documents, surveillance reports, all proof of the conspiracy that had ensnared not just me but countless others. But as I reached the last page, my blood ran cold. Because there, stapled neatly to the back, was a photograph of my daughter. And underneath it, in handwriting I recognized as my wife's, were the words, "She's next." The world tilted, my heart stuttered, and I realized the fight wasn't over, it was only beginning. The storm finally passed, though it didn't feel like it. The main character sat in the quiet aftermath, the weight of everything they had discovered pressing down like an invisible anchor that wouldn't let go. The truth had come out in jagged fragments, stitched together by betrayal, grief, and the realization that the life they thought they were living had been built on secrets. They had uncovered the conspiracy, exposed the lies, and pulled back the curtain on the people they once trusted most, but the cost was something that could never truly be repaid. Every moment replayed in their mind, from the first strange clue to the final confrontation, as if life itself had been a trap meant to test how much they could endure before breaking. And now, even though the danger seemed over, the silence didn't bring peace. It only reminded them of how far from normal they had drifted. It was in that silence that they realized some scars don't heal, they just become part of who you are. In the days that followed, the world kept moving, neighbors smiled as though nothing had happened, the sun rose and set just the same, yet the main character carried the knowledge that nothing could ever go back to the way it was. Friends looked different now, not in their faces but in their eyes, because once you've seen how quickly loyalty can turn into betrayal, you can't look at people the same again. There were apologies offered, explanations given, and even moments of fragile reconciliation, but they all felt like band-aids over wounds that cut to the bone. What haunted them most wasn't just the danger they had faced, but the question of how much of it had been avoidable if only they had seen the signs sooner. They wondered if the betrayal had started years back, if quiet whispers and strange absences had been pieces of a puzzle they had ignored because it was easier to believe life was fine. At night, when they lay in bed, they replayed the final moments over and over, trying to make sense of it all. The villain's last words, part threat, part confession, echoed like a riddle that refused to fade. The evidence they had uncovered explained so much, yet left a shadow of doubt, a suggestion that maybe not everything was revealed, that maybe someone else was still pulling strings from the dark. They wanted to believe it was finished, that the truth was theirs to hold, but there was always that lingering fear that they had only scratched the surface of something deeper. And when they closed their eyes, they saw faces, some guilty, some innocent, and some that blurred between the two, reminding them how fragile trust really is. The resolution wasn't about justice, not really. Justice was messy, incomplete, and often unsatisfying. The real resolution was survival, the fact that they had endured what was meant to destroy them, that they had chosen to face the truth rather than hide from it. They had walked through fire and come out the other side, changed but unbroken. The family they thought was shattered began to rebuild, not perfectly but with honesty this time, because the lies had nearly consumed them and they refused to let it happen again. Even so, there were empty chairs at the table, people who would never return, relationships that couldn't be repaired, and those absences were reminders of the price truth demands. But as the main character stood at the edge of it all, breathing in a future that felt uncertain but still theirs, they felt a strange calm settle in. Not because everything made sense, it didn't, but because they finally accepted that not every mystery can be fully solved, not every question has a clear answer, and sometimes the best you can do is live with the pieces you've uncovered. They had learned that truth doesn't set you free, It changes you, reshapes the way you see the world, and forces you to carry its weight whether you're ready or not. And in that understanding they found a quiet strength, the kind that doesn't fade even when the lights go out. Yet, just when they began to feel the first flicker of peace, they noticed something small but chilling. An envelope slipped beneath their door, plain, unmarked, waiting silently on the floor. Their hand trembled as they picked it up, their breath catching as they slid it open, only to find a single sentence written inside. Asterisk, you only think it's over. Asterisk,